Hello, I'm Sami Azrin, and this is my presentation on William Cullen Bryant. William Cullen Bryant was born on November 3rd, 1794, in the small town of Cummington, Massachusetts. As a child, he learned both Latin and Greek, and he was a precocious young writer. He was published at the age of 12, and in the next year, his poem, The Embargo, or The Sketches of the Times, a satire by a youth of 13, was used by his father in a Federalist pamphlet. The overtly political themes of his early work would continue well into his adult poetry. And as a teenager, he attended Williams College briefly and then Yale, but he did not study for Yale for very long because his father was not capable of paying for his tuition. So he continued to write poetry in his free time and also took up a job with a family friend at a law firm in hopes of becoming a lawyer. And he did successfully become a lawyer. He passed the bar in 1815 at the age of 21. And then the next year in 1816, he opened his own law partnership. But despite his professional success as a lawyer, he was not happy at all as a lawyer. He preferred poetry, and he saw being a lawyer as something he just did to get by financially, especially after he married Frances Fairchild in 1821 and had two daughters. But in 1821, he was also invited to give the Harvard commencement speech, at which he read one of his poems called The Ages. And people really liked this poem. His poem was very well received, and it motivated him to publish a collection of his poetry so far called just simply Poems. And it was a commercial breakthrough. It allowed him to become financially able to just be a poet and to work in the literary field instead of a lawyer. He quit his day job as a lawyer, and he spent the rest of his life working as an editor for the New York Review and Athenaeum magazine. And he became very famous and well respected as a literary figure while in New York. He was a literary celebrity whose popularity was only eclipsed by figures such as Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and Ralph Waldo Emerson. His seminal poem, The Nautopsis, was not only well received in the United States, but worldwide. And when he died, the entire city of New York flew their flags at half mast, and he had a massive funeral. This picture I have right here is actually of his funeral. So, Thanatopsis. So, this poem starts, like a lot of Romanticist poems, with extolling nature. It begins with a brief passage in which the speaker describes nature's ability to speak to each of its inhabitants in accordance with their feelings. So, happy people will hear nature having a voice of gladness and see a smile, as he says. And then, while people experiencing distressing thoughts will find in nature, quote, healing sympathy that steals away their sharpness, end quote. And then the poem after this brief segment quickly shifts into focusing on mortality. In the closing lines of the first stanza, Brian writes, quote, and lost, each human trace surrendering up, thine individual being shalt thou go, to mix forever with the elements. In these lines, Brian is espousing his belief that when a human being dies, they give up any and all forms of their individuality and they become one with the earth. For Brian, any and all forms of life are temporary, while only nature remains eternal. And despite the morbid nature of the poem, it is, at its core, I think, quite optimistic. The closing lines of the poem go, quote, approach thy grave, like one who wraps the drapery of his couch about him and lies down to pleasant dreams. Brian does not see death as something to be feared, but rather a part of a natural process which he gladly accepts and even seems to embrace, and encourages his readers to feel the same. To a Waterfowl is a poem which describes its speaker looking to nature, more specifically a determined flight of the waterfowl to find motivation to push through hardship. The first stanza describes the determined waterfowl flying in the dark, the rain, and alone, yet not landing or giving up. We see the benefit of the waterfowl not giving up immediately in the second stanza. Brian writes, quote, vainly the fowler's eye might mark thy distant flight to do thee wrong. If the waterfowl flies low enough to the ground or lands, he will be shot. So in spite of the difficult conditions, the waterfowl must fly on. He has no choice but to fly. And in the fourth stanza, Brian writes, quote, there's a power whose care teaches thy way along that pathless coast, end quote. From these two lines, especially the usage of the capital P in the word power, we can gather that Brian believes the waterfowl's determination and ability to guide itself is born out of a higher power's providence. The last two lines, quote, in the long way that I must trace alone, will lead my steps aright, end quote, tie the poem together and lay its meaning bare. The speaker, presumably human, has observed the faithful and determined flight of the waterfowl and has gathered that through determined faith in God's providence, he too will find strength and guidance in his journey, even if it is a quote long way. Now, sonnet to an American painter departing for Europe. This poem, as the title implies, is a sonnet and it is written as a direct address to the painter Thomas Cole. Cole was an American painter who embarked on a 3 year journey to Italy beginning in 1829. Bryant tells Cole that while in Italy, quote, "Thine eyes shall see the light of distant skies," end quote, referring to the fact that Cole will experience life differently in a foreign country. Bryant then reminds him, quote, "Yet, Cole, thy heart shall bear to Europe's strand a living image of thy native land, such as on thy own glorious canvas lies," end quote. Brian, a patriotic American, wants Cole to remember that even while he's across the world in Europe, he still exists as a living image of the glory of his native land of the United States. Brian also poses that Cole's living glory inherent in him as an American is reflected in the spirit of his paintings. I think this is a cool image. Lastly, Brian, the ever patriotic American, encourages Cole to, quote, "keep the earlier, wilder image bright," end quote. Brian, in his concluding line, is reminding Cole to not forget the spirit and the image of his native land of America. Now, the prairies. In this poem, we see Brian extol the natural beauty of the Midwestern prairies and also describe his vision of the indigenous people who previously inhabited the area. The poem was written after Brian visited his brothers in Illinois and encountered the American prairies for the first time in 1832. From this poem, we learned that he was extremely fond of the landscape, going so far as to calling the prairies the, quote, "gardens of the desert," referring to the Garden of Eden. After recalling the tranquility and beauty of the landscape and the wildlife, Brian asks, quote, "Have ye found a nobler or lovelier scene than this?" End quote. Suffice to say, he really likes the plains. The poem then shifts into something of a vision, wherein Brian imagines the lives of indigenous people who inhabited the area before they, quote, "passed away." That's probably not how it should be described. His vision includes floods of bison, temples, quote, warlike hunter tribes, young couples, and chiefs. At the tail end of the poem, Brian imagines the westward expansion of the United States. He writes, quote, "I hear the sound of that advancing multitude, which soon shall fill these deserts. From the ground comes up the laugh of children, the soft voice of maidens, and the sweet solemn hymn of Sabbath worshippers." This, of course, refers to the manifest destiny and the expulsion and murder of the subjects which Brian speaks of previously. Death of Lincoln. This poem was Bryan's response to the 1865 assassination of Abraham Lincoln. It was published just 5 days after the event. In this poem, Bryan extols the virtues of Lincoln. He praises his sense of justice, his mercy, and expresses a deep sense of grief in the wake of his untimely passing. Bryan also places definite emphasis on Lincoln's greatest achievement, something that not even his assassination could take away, writing, quote, "Thy task is done, the bond are free, we bear thee to an honored grave," end quote. Bryan was an ardent supporter of Lincoln, a staunch opponent of slavery, and this poem gives us a good sense of how deeply his assassination affected him. Now his case for the syllabus. Bryan was one of America's most well-respected and widely read poets during his life. He was just as widely read and influential as writers like Longfellow and Emerson. And after reading about his life and work, I was genuinely surprised I had not heard of him or been assigned his work earlier. Apart from popularity and influence, I'm personally quite fond of his work. The 5 poems of his that I read were all vivid and had evocative imagery and also flowed very well. I was especially struck by how beautifully he wrote about nature and how beautifully he was able to tie these images of nature into religious, political, and historical topics. I love the way he writes about death, spirituality, and the country of the United States, even if I do not personally agree with all of his sentiments. I believe his most obvious comparison as a romanticist American poet is Walt Whitman, but I think that his work is sufficiently distinct to warrant his inclusion beside Walt Whitman in the Romanticism unit for this class. One reason I believe this to be the case is that Bryan was much more outspoken in his work when it comes to politics. I, again, do not agree with some of his sentiments, but including overtly political work from American Romanticist poets would be valuable for the class, in my opinion. Lastly, I like the fact that he's lesser known than Whitman. There are much more important factors for choosing an author to put on the syllabus, but I do like the idea of learning about lesser known yet still important authors such as Bryan and the works cited.